I thought we could commence with a little meditation, which is appropriate for our times. Nature has linked all parts of her empire together by subtle threads of magnetic sympathy, and there is a mutual correlation even between a star and a man. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for that very imperious introduction, if I may put it that way, beautifully put. And it's wonderful to be with all of you. Let us remind ourselves that in these difficult times, we are also celebrating the 250th birth of one of the greatest elevators of all humanity. And that is this genius. Can you see him? Ludwig van Beethoven. And in his last string quartet in F major, he wrote on the title, A Difficult Decision. Then under the slow introduction, he wrote in German, Muss es sein, which means, must it be? To which, in the next bar, he wrote, Es muss sein, yes, it must be. So we've come through a difficult period, and it must be the way it is because we've created it. But Erica must be congratulated for making this difficult decision to transmute the European School from Edinburgh to Zoom. That's quite a transmutation, if I may put it that way. And we are all learning. So seriously, I would like feedback because I've never done a Zoom and I like to stand up and talk, but this is different. So let's carry on. I'm sure you can see that beautiful picture in front of you. That's one of Erica's floral sculptures. So let's set the theme. The great Schiller said that the universe is a thought of deity, that this thought form overflows into actuality, and so the world that's been born thereof has realized the divine plan. And so it's the calling of all thinking beings to rediscover in this existent whole the original design. So whether we consider the Sri Yantra in the East or in the West, the Tetractys or the Kabbalah, all these sublime philosophies have realized the connection between the divine plan and the world that's been born thereof. And that plan is, as Beethoven explicitly said, through music, and sacred mathematics is another aspect of music and harmony. And that has been given its most glorious uplift by two of the greatest mathematicians, Isaac Newton, who explicitly said that his whole work, his whole system was to demonstrate that there is a supreme being. And the other genius was Srinivasa Ramanujan, who said, an equation for me has no meaning unless it expresses the thought of God. Here you have the connection immediately. The thought of God, a supreme being, the universe is a thought of deity. So let's set the plan. I'll talk about the historical aspects and a bit of overlap in their personal lives. But the most important is part two, their spiritual resonance, what they had in common, how did they scale the heights, and where such genius must come from the wonder child Newton and from a bursting mathematical supernova Ramanujan. So in 1642, Galileo died, and in the same year, Newton was prematurely born at Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, 1 hour after 25th of December 1642, on the night of the full moon, England's very greatest Christmas present to the whole world, in my opinion. And two women who hurried to the nearby village to fetch some medicine did not expect to find the sickly child alive. He was so small that he could have been fitted right into a quart jug, a small little jug. Newton's mother, Hannah Ayscough, was a simple lady, barely literate. Newton's father, Isaac Newton, was a yeoman, a farmer, completely illiterate, bear this in mind, illiterate, unable to write even his own name. And Newton's father died 3 months before his son was born. So when young Isaac was 3 years old, his mother remarried a parson and went to live with him, leaving young Isaac in the care of his maternal grandmother and uncle. Ramanujan was born just after sunset on the 22nd of December, 1887. Now that makes him H.B. Blavatsky's contemporary, doesn't it? By, 4 years? And Ramanujan was born into a Tamil Brahmin family in his maternal grandmother's home. His father worked as a clerk in a sari shop. His mother was a housewife who sang in the local temple. Neither Newton nor Ramanujan were born into a family distinguished by intellectual achievements or professional career. As I said, Newton's father was illiterate, his mother barely educated. Ramanujan's parents received only the very barest education of poverty-stricken folk in South India. Both sets of parents were uneducated. That does not mean that they were unintelligent. But financially, the Newton family was far, far better off. So this is Newton's manor home in Lincolnshire, the famous garden with the apple tree and the room where he conducted his legendary experiments in optics. And this is where Ramanujan was born, after which he lived with his parents in this little home, which is now a museum. What was Newton's childhood like? Obviously, chief qualities of intense curiosity, precociousness, lonely, melancholy, withdrawn, and initially very backward and quite undistinguished at school, with no indication of his dormant genius that awakened when he was 18 years old. There were great drawings of artistic sensitivity, and he made clocks and sundials. But the absent-mindedness of the 10-year-old Newton, absorbed in his meditations, provides a clue to his latent genius. Near his home, there is a hill called Spittlegate Hill, and it's so steep you had to get off your horse. So young Newton dismounted the horse, and the horse slipped his bridle, just slipped the bridle. And young Newton carried on walking for 5 miles holding the empty reins in his hand because he was so absorbed in his meditation. So that provides a clue. Ramanujan, a lonely child, of course, as you would expect at school, his peers could never understand him. Bouts of ill health dogged him throughout his whole life. At the age of 2, he nearly died of smallpox, and he contracted a bout of amoebic dysentery, which, unless adequately treated, remains a permanent infection. And this untreated infection contributed to his early death, misdiagnosed as TB, but what was later known during the First World War as tropical liver disease. But ill health is not something that Newton and Ramanujan have in common at all. Ramanujan, now note this, had no formal training in pure mathematics. He lost his scholarship to study at Government Arts College as he was so obsessed with mathematics that he failed to clear all other subjects. He didn't have a college degree. And he wrote to several prominent mathematicians, but most of them did not respond, as they dismissed him as a bit of a crank because of the lack of sophistication. But as stated by none other than his mentor at Cambridge, Godfrey Hardy, Ramanujan, when only 10 years old, had discovered Leonhard Euler's theorems for sine and cosine, and was very disappointed that he was not the first to have discovered them. And by the age of 13, he completely mastered trigonometry. But paper was expensive for the young poverty-stricken Ramanujan. He said, "When food is a problem, how can I find money for paper? I may require 4 reams of paper every month." So what he did was he used a slate, and he wrote down his rough jottings on the slate and committed them to paper when he was satisfied with them. How did their lives play out? In Newton's case, 3 distinct phases. The youth who went to King Edward Grammar School aged 12 and joined Cambridge at the age of 19. And during that period, from the age of 22 to 25, was his creative peak during the plague and fire of London, when he discovered and wrote tremendous works on optics, calculus, and gravity, elected Lucasian professor, member of the Royal Society, and at age 51, he returned back, or he went to London rather, after having recovered from a rather serious nervous or psychic collapse. In London, he was warden and master of the Mint, which is the exact equivalent of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in modern terms, and then president of the Royal Society. But during all this time, from his late youth to his time in London, he was deeply engaged in the mystic and alchemical quest, which scientists these days have done everything to try and discount, but now overwhelming proof has come, so they cannot deny it. They cannot deny it. Here you have a polymath. In Ramanujan's case, we have a single-minded dedication to his whole life, to mathematics. He was married, according to Brahmin custom, to a 10-year-old girl. But then, as is the custom, the girl then lives with her own family and then returns to the marital home around age 16 or 18 or whatever. But by that time, Ramanujan was in Cambridge, so he hardly saw much of his wife. He passes his matriculation examination and gets a clerical post in the Madras Port Trust, and then writes his first letter to Hardy, who then arranges a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge, which he joins age 26, and he is elected a Fellow of the Royal Society at the age 31, and then returns to India and dies a year later. So we have the awakening, the flowering, and the decline. Let's see how their personal lives have overlapped, albeit over 3 centuries. Here you have Newton at Cambridge, and you have Ramanujan at Cambridge, of course. Both are members of the Royal Society. First, the Royal Society was at Crane Court in London, then it moved to Burlington House. Now, why have I shown those fruits and vegetables, or vegetables there? Can anyone think why? Well, they were both vegetarians. As simple as that. They were both vegetarians. And how interesting that both were born under the sign of Capricorn, only 3 days apart. 25th of December, Newton, 22nd of December for Ramanujan. Now, what were the circumstances under which Newton went to Cambridge? It was obvious that he wasn't cut out for a farming career, as his mother had wished. So he was sent to Cambridge upon the insistence of his grammar school headmaster when he was 18 years old. If we fast forward 3 centuries, how did Ramanujan land up at Cambridge? In 1913, just before the war, the famous British mathematician Godfrey Hardy received a letter at Cambridge, completely out of the blue, and the British colonial stamps and curious handwriting caught his attention. And the letter started like this: I beg to introduce myself to you as a clerk in the accounts department of the Port Trust office at Madras on a salary of only £20 per annum. I'm now about 23 years of age. I've had no university education, but I've undergone the ordinary school course. Now, just imagine that the top mathematician at Cambridge in the world gets a letter from a young boy said he's had no education. But then he goes on reading, and he is flabbergasted to find pages upon pages crammed with equations, many of which he had never seen before. Hardy was the leading number theorist in the world. How could he not recognize the identities relating to such numbers scribbled on rough paper? Were these new derivations, or were they just nonsensical mathematical scrolls? Later, Hardy would admit about these formulas, they defeated me completely. I had never seen anything in the least like it before. And that letter was, of course, written by the poverty-stricken, marginally employed young Srinivasa Ramanujan, who had little, if any, mathematical training, but an uncanny ability to derive mathematical identities seemingly out of the void. The equations came with no proof. This famous episode immediately bore fruit, for Hardy joined forces with others in Madras in attaining a research studentship for young Ramanujan, so he could pursue his mathematical research full-time and work with Hardy. Now let's look at what Newton achieved only, I say only, at Cambridge. Here we have the polymath. You can read all this. Mythology, chronology, tremendous biblical analysis and writings, prophecy, hundreds of papers on God and the Trinity, all that in addition to what Newton is, of course, most famously known for, is mathematics, natural philosophy, and optics, and all-night study and experiments in physiology, chemistry, and especially alchemy. In Ramanujan's case, there was the single-minded devotion to the analytic theory of numbers, partition functions, all of these mathematical functions, his master theorem, his primes. There's no point in describing what all these mathematical functions are, because I'm sure you know it all. So let's move on. But here we distinguish between the polymath, who lived to the age of nearly 85, and the single-minded genius who died at the age of 32, incidentally only 1 year after. I always think of the great Franz Schubert, who died at the age of 31, and Ramanujan dies at 32. Both geniuses mathematicized God's thoughts, if I can put it that way. Here you have an example of Newton's handwriting, calculating logarithms to 55 decimal places. And Newton's mathematical works have only been published in 1933. And here you have 8 huge volumes. Hope you can see this. These are Newton's mathematical works, and each volume is about 6 inches thick and full A4 size. They're not penguin books. In Ramanujan's case, here is a page from his famous notebook stating his master theorem, which mathematicians are still using to find insights into the radiation and other phenomena from black holes. But note the integration symbol, and that integration symbol, this, is the supreme achievement of the great Newton, who invented the calculus, along with Leibniz, of course. So it's thanks to Newton that we have that great stream of mathematical learning that has flowed down through Ramanujan and others, and of course before Newton, but the calculus was the great invention of Newton and Leibniz. Both great geniuses left a lot of unfinished works. But before that, let me show you a picture of Hardy. It's pretty obvious who Hardy is in that picture, the archetypal professor with young Ramanujan. And here he is with his colleagues, obviously the smallest boy in the class. Here you have the Prince of Intuition, and here you have the Apostle of Proof, who always wanted proof for anything you said. It was Hardy who recommended or who proposed Ramanujan to the Royal Society, and this is the certificate of election to the Royal Society. Both left treasures buried. In Newton's case, there were boxes and stacks of works on alchemy and theology that were auctioned in the most infamous Sotheby's sale in the 1930s. In Ramanujan's case, a box containing a whole stack of mathematical scribbles was discovered at Trinity College, Cambridge. And then there were his lost notebooks, of which 3 of them are most famous, and they've now been assembled. So this now completes the historical part of this talk. And now we move on to their spiritual resonance, so to speak. But for that, we have to try and understand their psychology. What do they have in common? As a teenager, Newton recorded all his confessions, 58 of them, against God, in the shorthand that was used by Samuel Pepys. And his confessions were, for example, making a mouse trap on Die Day, on Sunday that is, squirting water on Die Day, robbing my mother's box of sugar and plums. Now work this one out, this confession, from a teenage boy, having unclean thoughts, words, actions, and dreams. In Ramanujan's case, we see qualities again of intense introspection, loneliness, and a deeply religious outlook. So their psychological similarities were. In Newton's youthful notebook, he writes, and this is his own words, "I am so afraid the ship sinketh, you make a fool of me. No one understands me, I cannot but weep." Surely this shows a highly puritanical, ascetic, high morality, along with low self-esteem and ultra-sensitive to criticism. He was obviously absent-minded, the archetypal professor, and completely celibate. In Ramanujan's case, he was very self-assured, but yearned for public acknowledgement, a deep sense of shame, and a pathological sensitivity to any public humiliation. He attempted suicide, and he was lost to the world, of course, when immersed in mathematics. Newton was celibate. Ramanujan was, as I explained earlier, virtually celibate. He married a 10-year-old girl, but 5 years later he was in Cambridge, and when he returned to India in the last year of his life, he was much too ill. In Newton's case, a sin in thought was equivalent to a sin in deed. There is no difference. If you think sinfully, you might as well say you've acted sinfully. An open Bible, therefore, was Newton's daily guide to conduct. Ramanujan, a deeply devout Hindu, credited his mathematical capacities to divinity and stated that the mathematical knowledge he displayed was revealed to him by his family goddess. We'll come back to this point shortly, but the fact is both were deeply religious, but on different paths. But those different paths are, frankly, an irrelevant detail for our purposes. Let's now talk about something that I feel very strongly about, the so-called mechanical clockwork universe that is ascribed to Newton. I put it this way, Newton was not a Newtonian. At school and university, I was taught Newtonian mechanics like everyone else. It was the great Blavatsky who opened my eyes, saucer wide, about the dogmatic and universally mistaken idea that Newton regarded the universe as a machine kick-started by God, who then stepped aside, other than occasionally tinkering with his creation. The majority of scientists still hold this view about one of the most mystically and deeply, profoundly religious men of all times. They seem just to have regurgitated for second, third, fourth hand the prejudice down the centuries. None have read the original manuscript, which Blavatsky has pointed out in The Secret Doctrine, where Blavatsky says, at the outset of Principia, Newton took the greatest care to impress the fact that he did not use the word attraction in terms of in the physical sense. It was a purely mathematical conception involving no consideration of primary and physical causes. So if we now look at Principia, there's nothing like looking at the original work. If we look at Principia, this is what Blavatsky said. What does Newton say in there? He says, I use the word attraction, impulse, propensity, considering these forces not in the physical, but only in the mathematical sense. Hence, readers must beware that I am not talking about any mechanical physical effects. And then Newton goes on to say, in the preceding books, I've laid down the principles of philosophy, philosophical, not but mathematical. So let's just illustrate this point. What do we mean by this word? Principles not philosophical, but mathematical. Here is a physical spline. You can see me moving it. And I've bent it into this shape. That shape can be put in mathematical terms in terms of this simple parabola. And the formula is y equals x squared. When x is 1, y is 1. When x is 2, y is 4. Simple as that. Now, the point I'm making is there is a relation between the physical and the mathematical. The two are not the same. The formula does not tell you the color of this. It does not tell you what it tastes like if you care to eat it. It does not tell you what it sounds like when you bend it. It is a mathematical description. So Newton's great work was a mathematical depiction of the cosmos. It was not saying the cosmos is a clockwork by mechanistic principles. That is so important. So the essential mathematical mental nature of the universe is the point of greatest contact between Ramanujan and Newton. And I would maintain that each one of Newton's great equations also expressed a thought of God, hence their enduring durability, if I may put it that way. So the title of Newton's great work is Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, not Mechanica. There is a huge difference. So having put this to rest, how did these rare souls attain to such tremendous heights? Sri Aurobindo said this: the moment sees, the ages struggle to express. And the great economist Lord Keynes said, Newton's muscles of intuition were the strongest with which a man has ever been gifted. There is a story that when the astronomer Edmund Halley of Halley's Comet challenged Newton about a certain planetary orbit, Newton responded with, well, I've known it for years, but if you want a proof, I'll find it, which he did, of course. But the point I'm making is the proof was only a way of demonstrating what the great man knew inwardly. And the Nobel physicist Richard Feynman said in his Nobel speech, "Far more is known than can ever be proven." Now, in Ramanujan's case, how did he get to his wonderful formulae? Ramanujan said, "While asleep, I had an unusual experience. There was a red screen formed by flowing blood, as it were. I was observing it. Suddenly, a hand began to write on the screen. I became all attention. The hand wrote a number of elliptic integrals. They stuck to my mind. As soon as I woke up, I committed them to writing." And furthermore, Ramanujan's mother actually received permission from Namagri Thaya, the family goddess, for Ramanujan to go to England. She received this in a dream stated by no less a figure than Godfrey Hardy. And that dream was because Brahmin custom then forbade overseas travel. So what I'm implying is this ability to read in the Akashic records the universal tablets of nature's indelible memory was, of course, shown in great, evidence in great measure by none other than Blavatsky. How else could a woman generally in ill health, with a library of some 30 books, quote from well over 10,000 references with page numbers and every detail of punctuation? This ability, of course, is well known amongst the great composers. Mozart was well known to be writing down something while a new idea was flowing into his mind at the same time. And note, I said into his mind, not his brain. Brain is the recording instrument. So how do these great geniuses work? Let's look at it like this. What is intuition? Sri Aurobindo says the age struggle to express and the moment sees. I tell you the story of Lord Keynes and Haley. And with Ramanujan, he had no formal training, and he intuited mathematical functions that have put him on an equal footing with the great mathematicians like Jacobi and Euler. Now, I would suggest this diagram, it looks more complicated than it is. How does one achieve anything? Let's start at the beginning. How does one achieve? We first have to think about something. So it's like winding up the muscles of the mind. Think of a coiled spring. You're winding up a coiled spring. You're increasing the tension. So we go from concrete mind to abstract mind, and finally, in that moment of silence, there is that flood, that lightning flash of intuition. But that's not good enough because only you know it. So this is the concentration, the intellectual wind-up. In order to prove it, having wound up, you've got to wind down again. There's got to be the intellectual workout, the expansion, to state in terms known to man what you only inwardly experienced in that moment of silence. So here we have intuitive knowing, going to mathematical proof, and finally going to experimental verification. This is the path of mysticism. This is the path of science, and both are needed equally. Now, why are some individuals so rarely gifted? We'll have to part company with some of the materialistic dogmas that blight our age. Wallace, the great colleague at one time and co-author of a joint paper with Charles Darwin, openly said, the present gigantic development of mathematical faculty is wholly unexplained by the theory of natural selection and must be due to some altogether distinct cause. He didn't quite say what the cause was, but he said natural selection does not do it. So let's part with a few dogmas. We have to get rid of these dogmas that Darwinism is the sole explanatory theory of evolution, that the brain generates consciousness, and human life exists only on the Earth, apart from microbacteria in space and other planets, and that life expresses only through the physical body, and life and consciousness are the product of blind forces in matter. So if we hold these dogmas in abeyance, let us look at the spectrum of man in these terms. Let's think of the analogy of electricity flowing from a power station to the domestic consumer, your house. Now, it doesn't come down all in one wire. You have transformer stations. Here they are. And the transformer stations step down, in simple terms, the voltage to a level that the domestic consumer can handle. And usually there are 3, if not more, transformer stations. Similarly, we have divine consciousness step down by 3 transformer stations: the spiritual soul, the human soul, and the animal soul, so that the divine consciousness can flow into the physical body, because without these transformers, that would simply explode your house like that would explode your physical body. In terms of a familiar, different analogy, we have the solar, the lunar, and the body. In more theosophical terms, we have monadic evolution, intellectual evolution, and Darwinian evolution. And no one is saying Darwinian evolution does not matter. We are saying it is very far from the whole story. And just as the sunlight is dimmed by the clouds and the atmosphere and the water, so also the spiritual light is dimmed by the intervening vestures. But let's now develop this. There is a triple evolutionary scheme: the spiritual, the intellectual, and the physical, which are all interwoven, which is why man is such a complicated creature. Humanity now, in its present stage on Earth, has evolved through root races, and root races, of course, have nothing to do with racial types. They refer to phase states of consciousness. Just as each human being goes through stages of infancy, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, so also the human race as a whole goes through these phases as well. So what is of critical importance is this: physical nature could not evolve intelligence without superior assistance. the formation of the human form, both physical and superphysical, involved the creative hierarchies who were responsible for the perfection of the human vehicles. The form of the body was provided by earlier schemes of evolution known as the creative Elohim, or in Christian terms, if you like, the Adam of dust, or in Sanskrit terms as Varishads. What does Varishad mean? It means sitting by the fire. What does fire signify universally? Fire signifies mind. This means that the earlier races of humanity had mind, but the mind principle had to be switched on, so to speak. There was no electricity flowing through the spark plugs of the mind, so to speak. And it was the task of the superior classes, known as the solar angels or the sons of fire, to awaken the mind of early humanity. Mind is the link between spirit and matter, and thereafter man, previously non-responsible, became the responsible creature he now is supposed to be, knowing good from evil. And the connection between the solar angels with humanity is the basis of the various mythologies and legends, such as the fall of the angels. The solar angels literally had to sacrifice their higher evolutionary status and fall into a lower class of being, the Varishads that is, in order to awaken their minds. Now, why am I saying all this? As I said, fire represents the mind or intelligence. In Genesis, the serpent urged Adam and Eve to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. When they did, they became like gods. So what it means is our consciousness and our mind is that of the sons of fire, to the extent that this august host was able to project its essence in us. So entirely dependent on karma, in some cases, the solar angels were able to incarnate fully into the mindless human form. And these became the Mahatmas, the Adepts, and the Rishis. In other human forms, the solar angels were able only to project a spark. And these were the average humanity. So the vast range of the mind quality we find between the imbecile, the average man, the genius, and the sage is precisely the extent to which the solar angels were able to awaken the mind. This happens now, if you think about it. Every parent and teacher knows that the amount of wisdom or learning that you can project or infuse into a pupil depends entirely on the preparedness of the receiving mind. Even Franz Liszt could not teach a student to play the piano if he has not mastered his basic technique. Newton couldn't teach you calculus before you learn your basic algebra. So the point about this is this. As Plutarch said, the earth has given the body, the moon the soul, and the sun the understanding to the generation of man. And in beautiful terms, as Blavatsky put it, what is human mind in its higher aspect? Whence comes it if it is not a portion of the essence, and in some rare cases of incarnation, the very essence of a higher being, one from a higher and divine plane. Sorry, flicking through the wrong slide. Right. So, as Blavatsky said then, some solar angels projected a spark into the human form, others entered the human form. So what I'm suggesting as to why people like Ramanujan and Newton are so gifted and how they attained to their genius was because here there is a strong infusion of the essence of the solar angels into the prepared mind. So the grade of mind displayed is a function of the amount of essence projected, spanning from a portion of the essence, the majority of the essence, and the very essence. And of course, the vast majority of humanity is a portion of the essence. So with that, I ask you to choose which of these two statements comes closer to the truth. This is Blavatsky saying, what is human mind if not a portion of the essence, the higher being, from a higher and diviner plane? Or this, that our joys, sorrows, memories, ambitions, everything, and presumably our mathematical genius, presumably, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Raise a finger, I can see you, if you know who said the second thing. That's Francis Crick. Francis Crick. I'm not knocking Francis Crick, but I'm pointing out the sheer limitation of what he said. He doesn't distinguish an informing principle from its vehicle of expression. The brain, the nerve cells are all important, but that's the violin upon which the violinist plays. But we're talking of mathematics, aren't we? So let me give you a quiz, a mathematical quiz. Are you ready? Do you see this number there? It's known as the Carmichael number, as I was informed by an astute mathematician at work. And as Ramanujan said, it can be it's the only number that can be represented as 1 cubed plus 12 cubed and 9 cubed plus 10 cubed. Now, what's the point of it? When Hardy visited Ramanujan in hospital in a sanatorium, just to make light conversation, Hardy told Ramanujan, well, my taxi number was 1729. And Ramanujan immediately jumped up and said, it's the only number that can be represented in two such ways. So he didn't have to think about it, he just got it straight away. So let's summarize and close down. This beautiful saying of Blavatsky, that physical man is a musical instrument, the higher self is the performing artist. And of course, if you have an imperfect instrument, the greatest artist cannot draw a beautiful sound from a cheap and cracked fiddle, because that depends entirely on the transmission to the objective plane of the unspoken divine thought. So physical man can be a priceless Stradivarius, note the word physical man, or a cheap and cracked fiddle, or mediocrity between the two, in the hands of the Paganini who ensouls him. Every man has a Paganini, but very, very few men physically are like the Stradivarius. So just then to bring this in context, that's the great Paganini, of course. The performing artist needs an instrument. The spiritual soul needs an instrument, the brain and body. And when the brain and body are like a Stradivarius, then we can recall that lovely saying in Light on the Path, that the soul of man is immortal and its future is the future of a thing whose growth and splendor has no limits.